Anti-Mormonism is discrimination, persecution, hostility or prejudice directed at members of the Latter-day Saint movement, particularly the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The term is often used to describe persons or literature that are critical of their adherents, institutions, or beliefs, or physical attacks against specific Mormons or the LDS Church as a whole. Opposition to Mormonism began before the first Latter-day Saint Church was established in 1830 and continues to the present day. The most vocal and strident opposition occurred during the 19th century, particularly during the Utah War of the 1850s, and in the second half of the century when the practice of polygamy in Utah Territory was widely considered by the U.S. Republican Party as one of the twin relics of barbarism, along with slavery. Modern-day opposition generally takes the form of websites offering alternative views about Mormonism and non-violent protest at large Latter-day Saint gatherings such as the Church's biannual General Conference, outside of Latter-day Saint pageants, or at events surrounding the construction of new LDS temples. Opponents generally believe that the Church's claims to divine origin are false, that it is non-Christian, or that it is a religion based on fraud or deceit on the part of its past and present leaders. Origin. The term anti-Mormon first appears in the historical record in 1833 by the Louisville Daily Herald in an article, "The Mormons and the Anti-Mormons." In 1841, it was revealed that an anti-Mormon almanac would be published. On August 16 of that year, the Latter-day Saint Times and Seasons reported the Mormons' confidence that although the anti-Mormon almanac was designed by Satan and his emissaries to flood the world with lies and evil reports, still, we are assured that in the providence of God they will ultimately tend to the glory of God, the spread of truth and the good of the Church. The anti-Mormon newspaper certainly was not the first of its kind. Mormonism had been criticized strongly by dozens of publications since its inception, most notably by Ebedy Howe's 1834 book Mormonism Unveiled. The Latter-day Saints initially labeled such publications anti-Christian, but the publication of the almanac and the subsequent formation of an anti-Mormon party in Illinois heralded a shift in terminology. Anti-Mormon became, on the lips of the Church's critics, a proud and politically charged self-designation. Today, the term is primarily used as a descriptor for persons and publications that oppose the LDS Church, although its precise scope has been the subject of some debate. It is used by some to describe anything perceived as critical of the LDS Church, siding with the latter, less inclusive understanding of the term. Latter-day Saint scholar William O. Nelson suggests in the Encyclopedia of Mormonism that the term includes any hostile or polemic opposition to Mormonism or to the Latter-day Saints, such as maligning Joseph Smith, his successors, or the doctrines or practices of the Church. Though sometimes well-intended, anti-Mormon publications have often taken the form of invective, falsehood, demeaning caricature, prejudice, and legal harassment, leading to both verbal and physical assault. Reaction. Many of those who have been labeled anti-Mormon object to the designation, arguing that the term implies that disagreement or criticism of Mormonism stems from some inherent anti-Mormon prejudice, rather than being part of a legitimate factual or religious debate. Eric Johnson, for example, makes a distinction between personal animosity and intellectual dialogue. Johnson insists that he is motivated by love and compassion for Mormons, and that while he pleads guilty to being against Mormonism, he finds the suggestion that he is anti-Mormon both offensive and inaccurate. Stephen Cannon elaborates, "It is also helpful to know that Mormons are a group of people united around a belief system, Therefore, to be anti-Mormon is to be against people. Christians who desire to communicate the gospel of Jesus Christ to Mormons are never to come against people of any stripe. Yes, evangelical Christians have strong disagreements with Mormonism, but the argument is with a belief system and not a people. The LDS people are no better and no worse than any other group of people. Any dispute is to be a disagreement with the Bullsum, not the Mormon. James White, meanwhile, rejects the term because of a lack of reciprocal terminology. He wrote to one LDS apologist, "If you'll identify yourself as an anti-Baptist, he'll let you call me an anti-Mormon." Even some members of the church who write negatively about it, especially those who call into question its divine nature, have had the writings labeled anti-Mormon. Ex-Mormons who write about the church likewise frequently labeled anti-Mormon, even when the writings are not inflammatory in nature. The debate on who is anti-Mormon frequently arises in Mormon discussions of authors and sources. Stephen Cannon has argued that use of the label is a campaign by Latter-day Saints to disavow the facts presented by simply labeling the source as anti-Mormon. Critics of the term also claim that the LDS Church frames the context of persecution in order to cultivate a persecution complex, or that Mormon authors promote the ideal of a promised heavenly reward for enduring persecution for one's beliefs. Mormons often respond to these accusations by questioning whether critics like Johnson and Cannon really have Mormons' best interests at heart. For Brigham Young University's 100-year board, the anti-Mormon label serves the purpose of warning Latter-day Saints away from individuals who espouse hatred and bigotry. It is better, says the board, for a confused saint to talk to someone that has your best interests at heart and actually understands what the church teaches. Those individuals and groups who challenge Mormonism, particularly those who approach the challenge from an evangelical Christian perspective, would generally sustain that they do, in fact, have the best interest of the Mormon at heart, and for the most part can legitimately claim to understand what the church teaches, since many challenges of Mormonism come from an LDS background. In addition, they often declare that highly charged words such as hatred and bigotry are employed to an excessive degree to describe any challenge to a truth claim, and often cite this reactionary response as part of the so-called Mormon persecution complex. History. Mormonism, or the Latter-day Saint movement, arose in western New York, the area where its founder, Joseph Smith, was raised. During a period of religious revival in the early 19th century, Smith claimed to have several visions involving God, Jesus and angelic Native American prophets. These claims were often not received well by those in the community, as evident in the following excerpt from Smith's account of LDS Church history. One of the Methodist preachers treated my communication with great contempt, saying it was all of the devil, that there were no such things as visions or revelations in these days, that all such things had ceased with the apostles, and that there would never be any more of them. I soon found, however, that my telling the story had excited a great deal of prejudice against me among professors of religion, and was the cause of great persecution, which continued to increase, and though I was an obscure boy, only between 14 and 15 years of age, and my circumstances in life such as to make a boy of no consequence in the world, yet men of high standing would take notice sufficient to excite the public mind against me, and create a bitter persecution, and this was common among all the sects, all united to persecute me. While the claims of a divine call often received a cold shoulder, the eventual publication of the Book of Mormon, and the official organization of the Church of Christ in 1830 were met with increased opposition on various fronts. In New York and Pennsylvania, anti-Mormon behavior dealt mainly with issues including whether or not Smith actually had the gold plates, if those plates belonged to the people rather than Smith, if Smith ever really had visions, Smith's treasure-digging episodes, and accusations of occult practices. In Ohio, anti-Mormons focused on the ill-fated banking efforts of the Kirtland Safety Society and other failed economic experiments including the United Order. In Missouri, once the gathering place of the Latter-day Saints, Mormons tended to vote as a bloc, wielding considerable political and economic influence, often unseating local political leadership and earning long-lasting enmity in the sometimes hard-drinking, hard-living frontier communities. These differences culminated in hostilities and the eventual issuing of an executive order by Missouri Governor Lilburn Boggs declaring, "The Mormons must be treated as enemies, and must be exterminated or driven from the state." 3 days later, a renegade militia unit attacked a Mormon settlement at Horns Mill, resulting in the death of 18 Mormons and no militiamen. The extermination order was not formally rescinded until 1976. In Nauvoo, Illinois, persecutions were often based on the tendency of Mormons to dominate community, economic, and political life wherever they resided. The city of Nauvoo had become the largest in Illinois. The city council was predominantly Mormon, and the Nauvoo Legion had grown to a quarter of the size of the U.S. Army. Other issues of contention included polygamy, freedom of speech, anti-slavery views during Smith's presidential campaign, and a deification of man. After the destruction of the press of the Nauvoo Expositor and institution of martial law, Joseph Smith was arrested on charges of treason against the state of Illinois and incarcerated in Carthage jail, where he was killed by a mob on June 27, 1844. The persecution in Illinois became so severe that most of the residents of Nauvoo fled across the Mississippi River in February 1846. In 1847, Mormons established a community hundreds of miles away in the Salt Lake Valley in Utah. Beginning in 1849, every federally appointed official left Utah under duress. In 1857, President Buchanan concluded that the Mormons in the territory were rebelling against the United States. In response, President Buchanan sent 1/3 of the United States Army to Utah in 1857 in what is known as the Utah War. In 2007, the movie September Dawn portrayed Brigham Young and other Mormon leaders ordering the massacre of non-Mormon travelers passing through Utah, fearing they were the first in a wave of settlers to the territory. Though the LDS Church issued no comment on the film, Latter-day Saint members and several historical scholars protested these depictions, arguing that the filmmakers took great leaps of historical revisionism. Quote, "Approximately 120 immigrants from Arkansas were murdered at Mountain Meadows in southwestern Utah on September 11, 1857, after having surrendered to a body of Nauvoo Legion militiamen." Early publications. Much of this anti-Mormon sentiment was expressed in publications during the early part of LDS Church history. In his 2005 biography of Joseph Smith, Richard Lyman Bushman cites 4 1838 pamphlets as anti-Mormon: Mormonism Exposed by Sunderland, Mormonism Exposed by Batchelor, Antidote to Mormonism by M. Chesney, and Exposure of Mormonism by Livesey. The first was the work of Oregon Batchelor, who had no direct contact with the body of Mormons, and contained the contents of a debate between the author and Parley Pratt, with Pratt's side omitted. Bushman describes the author's rhetoric as indistinguishable from that uttered by scores of other polemicists of his time, providing a glimpse into the kind of material considered anti-Mormon. The pamphlet described Joseph Smith as a blockhead, a juggling, money-digging, a fortune-telling impostor, and, along with the Book of Mormon Witnesses, as perhaps the most infamous liars and impostors that ever breathed. By the deception and lies, they swindle them out of the property, disturb social order and the public peace, excite a spirit of ferocity and murder, and lead multitudes astray on the subject in which, of all others, they have the deepest interest. Quote, he voiced outrage at the miscreants who are battening on the ignorance and credulity of those upon whom they can successfully play off this imposture. Quote, he described the Book of Mormon as the most gross, the most ridiculous, the most imbecile, the most contemptible concern that was ever attempted to be palmed off upon society as a revelation. Quote, he believed the religion can be viewed in no other light than that of monstrous public nuisances, that ought forthwith to be abated, and that the Mormons were the most vile, the most impudent, the most impious, not of charlatans and cheat with which any community was ever disgraced and cursed. Antidote to Mormonism describes Mormons as miserable enemies of both God and man, engines of death and hell. Quote, he described combat with them as being desperate. The battle is one of extermination. Bushman describes the characteristics of these anti-Mormon materials as sensationalizing actuality. The critic's writings largely controlled the reading public's image of for the next century, with unfortunate results for biographers. The sharp caricature of Joe Smith as fraud and con man blotted out the actual person. He was a combination of knave and blockhead. No one had to explain what motives drove him. He was a fixed type, the confidence man, well known in the literature of antebellum America. Americans knew all about these insidious scoundrels who undermined social order and ruined the lives of their unsuspecting victims. Joseph Smith became the worst of the type, a religious fraud who preyed upon the sacred yearnings of the human soul. Sherlock Holmes. Arthur Conan Doyle's A Study in Scarlet, the novel in which the famous fictional detective Sherlock Holmes made his first appearance, includes a very negative depiction of the early Mormon community in Utah after its migration westwards and the foundation of Salt Lake City. Mormons are presented as violent, rigidly intolerant and corrupt, systematically terrorizing members of the church and forcing polygamous marriage on Mormon girls against the will. Later in his career, Conan Doyle apologized to the Mormons for his lurid account of them as being steeped in kidnapping, murder and enslavement. During a 1923 tour of the United States, Doyle was invited to speak at the LDS Church's Salt Lake Tabernacle, while some individual Mormons expressed their bitterness. In general, the atmosphere was warm and friendly, far beyond the famous author's best expectations, and in later writings he presented Mormons in a very positive light.